Hi, my name is Rick Bogle. I'm the co-executive director of a Madison-based animal rights organization called the Alliance for Animals. The Alliance was started in 1983 and since that time has been speaking out for all of the animals in the state of Wisconsin, no matter where they are, what's being done to them. The Alliance got started in 1983 because of concerns about what was going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The University of Wisconsin-Madison is the home to one of the now 8 national primate research centers in the United States. They're funded by the National Institutes of Health, and they all have a large number of invasive and cruel experiments going on involving monkeys. But the one I'm going to talk to you about right now is a study that shocks most people when they find out that the university has started it again. And to understand the nature of this, it has to do with maternal deprivation. So I need to first give you a little bit of history of the study of maternal deprivation and the University of Wisconsin-Madison's role in that research. First, let me just tell you a little bit about the history of maternal deprivation, or even the history of childcare. Because most people will tell you that the reason that any use of maternal deprivation, taking young animals away from their mothers at birth and raising them in relative isolation, they claim that the benefits will accrue to children that have been raised without parents or in situations where they're in homes without caregiving. In 1928, a medical doctor named John Watson wrote a book called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. And this was a quote from him. He said, never kiss your child. Never hold it in your lap. Never rock its carriage. And for a while, his idea that children should be seen as it and that they shouldn't be treated very kindly was the sort of the norm that doctors tried to communicate to parents. They thought that you should treat children as if they were machines, and if you could handle them in a certain way that they would grow up to be more upstanding people. But in 1935, other psychologists began to look at children that were raised without families. The best known one might be Renee Spitz, who in 1935 began systematic observations of mothers and children and what things mothers did with their children. And then he also started looking at children in orphanages. And he came to the conclusion, and this is a direct quote, the absence of mothering equals emotional starvation. And then in 1946, Dr. Benjamin Spock published the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. Spock threw all of the Watson's garbage out the window and said, don't be afraid to trust your own common sense. He said, what good mothers and fathers instinctively feel like doing is usually best. Spock's baby book was an instant runaway success. By the time he died in 1998, 50 million copies of the book had been sold. It had been translated into 42 languages. At the time that he died, I believe it was the second most published book, second only to the Bible. In 1948, after World War II, there were a number of children in European orphanages. And the World Health Organization started to look at the problem and try to figure out what could be done for all of the children that were orphaned as a result of the war. They commissioned a psychologist named John Bowlby to look at the problem. They commissioned him at the beginning of 1950, and just a little bit less than a year later, he published his book called Maternal Care and Mental Health. This is a quote. Maternal care and mental health was at once acclaimed an unqualified contribution to its subject. Its success is shown by the frequency with which it has been printed in the many languages into which it has been translated. The conclusion Bowlby reaches is that the prolonged deprivation of the young child of maternal care may have grave and far-reaching effects. So that was in 1952 that he published his work, and it immediately changed things. Hospitals started treating their child patients differently. People started understanding that they couldn't leave children isolated, that they would develop aberrant mental and emotional problems. But the real question that drove much later research was, why did children need maternal care? Why did they need the contact of a loving caregiver? And it became sort of an arcane argument and discussion among child psychologists and other psychologists. And that's the discussion that led to the use of monkeys in maternal deprivation experiments. And the best known person of that, the person that was, you might have seen in an old psychology book, Harry Harlow. This is a picture of him on the cover of On Wisconsin. His most famous experiments had to do with taking baby monkeys, taking them away from their mothers, giving them an opportunity to cling to a cloth mother that wasn't able to feed the baby, or a wire surrogate mother that had a bottle attached to her. Because one of the arguments that came up was, well, children only need that maternal care because the mother is able to nurse them. So unsurprisingly, what he discovered was that baby monkeys would cling to the cloth mother until they were hungry, and then they'd go over to this wire contraption and nurse, and then come back to the cloth-covered monkey. So that was Harlow's main discovery, that baby monkeys wanted to cling to something soft. And again, he entered into this discussion in his series of experiments because of very arcane discussions about why human children needed maternal or very warm, nurturing care. So there was an explosion of studies that started using animals and depriving them from their mothers and from all sorts of social input. They started isolating them for long periods of time, short periods of time, keeping them with other baby monkeys for a while, taking them away. Probably the peak bit of the cruelty that was going on was one of Harlow's studies, where he and a graduate student of his at the time named Stephen Suomi. This is a paper that was published in 1969. And what it does is it talks about a device that they invented that was a metal well. And it became to be called by Harlow himself as the well of despair. And so they would put monkeys into the very bottom of this stainless steel pit, and they would leave them there totally by themselves. And they found out that they would quickly essentially crush their emotional development, and this happened in short order. If they were in for very long at all, it was very hard to rehabilitate them. In some cases, they couldn't. In some cases, they left the monkeys isolated in these things and in isolation cages totally by themselves for up to 3 years. It was really, really horrible stuff that went on. He did all sorts of variations of those sorts of studies about isolating baby monkeys. They found out that this work never stopped. One of the things that happened was that in labs across the country that were trying to raise monkeys for other research purposes, they wanted to know how soon they could take them away from their mothers, how to split them up, and they wanted them typically in individual cages, because if a monkey's in an individual cage, it's easier to go in and grab that monkey and inject it or put some tube down its throat. So what they found out, though, is that if you isolate monkeys too soon, or even later in their life, that they develop aberrant behaviors. Like humans, if you're placed in solitary confinement, it tends to make you become very anxious, and you develop all sorts of psychological problems. So these studies went on and on at the university. In fact, let me just so to give you a feel for the sorts of things Harlow was doing. Here's just a list of some of the titles of his studies. Mother-infant separation in monkeys, social deprivation of monkeys, behavior of socially deprived rhesus monkeys, the effect of social deprivation, maternal separation in rhesus monkeys, effects of 3 months of total social deprivation. That was in 1966. In 1967, Harlow won the National Medal of Science for doing these crazy things. He was also the president of the American Psychological Association, who was elected in 1959, I believe it was, 58 or 59. And that was when he reported on his wire monkey, cloth monkey studies. Those studies went on until Harlow's death. And he left the university, he retired, moved away, and then a few of his graduate students continued to do this for a very short period of time, but then those studies disappeared. It was around the end of 1989 to the early part of 1990, and they haven't been done since. Maternal deprivation has been pretty widely condemned. It's obviously cruel, and there really isn't anything that we can learn from it. Everything that we need to know about maternal deprivation in children has been well known, and it's been demonstrated by studying human children. We also know that the best way to treat children who've grown up in deprived situations is to place them in the most warm and nurturing homes that we can. And we know that because of studies of children who've been raised in orphanages, particularly children that were raised in the Romanian orphanages. So earlier this year, we received a whistleblower communication. And the person who contacted us told us that the university was starting up its maternal deprivation work again. And it was really hard to believe. The University of Wisconsin has an indelible black mark on its history because of these horrible studies. Let me just really quick tell you, this is a book. I'm going to just read a passage from this. The book is Love at Goon Park. It's by Deborah Bloom. She's teaches journalism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's a fairly well-known book. But I'm just going to read you just a quick passage here to tell you how much everybody understands that the work was really something that shouldn't have been done anymore. This comes from near the end of the book. John Gluck, more than any of Harry's students, has tried to explore the ethical dilemmas raised by the specters of Harry's final experiments. Harry's colleagues, me included, never challenged him on the ethical points, Gluck says, flatly and with regret. The strengths of our spines were not sufficient to carry the weight of our professional goals and our conscience. End quote. Harry was not the kind of professor to encourage such discussion. Griffin, another student, wasn't the only student either who was discouraged. Gluck doesn't hold his professor responsible for that environment. I'm just saying that access to the moral resources, like empathy, comes from a community that sustains this kind of reflection. Harry neither created that type of community, nor did one emerge in the laboratory. There's that idea of ethical inspection apparently doesn't exist still in the oversight committees that approve research at the university. So after we got the whistleblower complaint, we did open records requests and started doing research. And the first thing we found out was that a woman named Allison Joy Bennett was involved in studies of monkeys who had been maternally deprived years ago and who now are still isolated, and she's looking at the way they learn. At first we thought that was the study that people were talking about, but it turns out it wasn't. It turns out that the chair of the UW-Madison Department of Psychiatry has been given approval to use maternal deprivation as a way to create highly anxious monkeys that he'll subject to a number of fearful experiences throughout their 1 year of life, and then he'll kill them and dissect their brains. So, according to his protocol, he's going to take monkeys away from their mothers within 24 hours of birth. He's going to then raise them in isolation in an incubator until they're up to 42 days old. We know from peer-reviewed scientific literature that keeping monkeys in isolation when they're that young causes severe emotional detriment to them. Monkeys can start self-biting as early as 32 days of age when they're kept in these situations. Self-biting is a euphemism used by the industry. What they really mean is self-mutilation. He's using 20 male baby monkeys that he's taking from the mothers, isolating them in the incubators, and then putting 2 of them together. This is called peer rearing. The literature is also very clear that peer-reared rhesus monkeys develop aberrant emotional behaviors. They don't have the sort of variety in their social contact, apparently, that is required for normal brain and emotional development. So, during the period that he's going to have them paired, he's going to periodically take them and do a number of different things to them. In some cases, he's going to put them in a room that they've never been in before. These are monkeys that are living in a stainless steel box, and so anything that's outside of the ordinary to them is frightful. They also, because they were kept in isolation, they're naturally fearful. He's going to have someone look at them that they've not seen before, turn their head away and look at them again. He's going to expose them to a live snake. He's going to expose them to monkeys they've not seen before. So he's going to do these things periodically over about a year's period of time. And then he's going to kill them. Those 20 monkeys and 20 other male monkeys that weren't raised in this way. And he's going to dissect their brains, and he's going to try to determine whether or not there's some sort of neurochemical differences or small neuroanatomical differences in their brains. He claims that by doing this, it's going to, well, let me tell you what he actually says. He wrote a letter to a local reporter who questioned him about this. So let me quote from that letter, because otherwise you'll think I'm making it up. So this is what he says, and I'm just going to read it straight through. It's just a very short paragraph. And again, this is written to the reporter. It's now widely accepted that early stressful environments that include parental stress, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect, and inadequate parenting are the most relevant risk factors for the later development of psychiatric illness. Unfortunately, this type of adversity during childhood is endemic in our society. These early adverse circumstances can change the trajectory of a developing brain such that it becomes wired in ways that leads less fortunate individuals down the path of anxiety, depression, and other forms of psychopathology. Discovering new interventions aimed at preventing the long-term consequences of early adversity in children is critical and requires a basic understanding of the influences of suboptimal rearing on the primate brain. Recent advances in neuroscience and molecular neurobiology allow us for the first time to identify promising new molecular pathways that have the potential to counter the effects of early adversity on childhood development. So let me paraphrase that for you. This is really important. He says that, remember, he's talking here about new molecular pathways to counter the effects of early adversity. And the early adversity that he just identified are parental stress, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and neglect and inadequate parenting. So, in other words, the new molecular pathways, he's saying that he hopes and believes that by isolating these baby monkeys, frightening them for a year, killing them, cutting up their brains, looking at the chemicals in their brains compared to monkeys that weren't treated this way, that he's going to find molecular pathways. He's going to be able to create, he claims, according to this, the implication is that he will be able to have someone help him develop a drug or a vaccination, a pill, some sort of medical intervention for something, for all of these problems, all of the psychopathologies, the anxiety, depression, psychopathologies that are caused from physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, parental stress, neglect, inadequate parenting. By looking at the chemistry of these monkeys' brains, he's going to come up, he claims, some sort of magic pill. It's absurd. In fact, all of the psychiatric chemicals that we have today, the way they work is very, very poorly understood. We know that they work in some cases, and some cases they don't. That's why psychiatrists try a variety of drugs on people that are particularly emotionally disturbed. But in many cases, in the case of Prozac and drugs along those, we don't really understand why they have the actions that they do. The idea that we're going to look at these chemical differences between isolated frightened monkeys and non-isolated, non-frightened monkeys and come up with a magic pill that's going to cure us of all of our ills that are the result of child abuse, or it's just sweeping in its arrogance. One of the things we do know, though, about treating children who are growing up in these sorts of circumstances is that what they really need is they need safety. They need to be placed in homes. They need to have direct intervention in the families. They need to be safe. They need to be hugged. They need to have someone who cares about them, protect them. That's what children in these situations need. Kalins' work seems to be focused on the idea that we're going to be able to look at children when they're born, perhaps vaccinate them so we can send them home and they can be abused and we won't have to worry about having to treat their illnesses later on. It's just crazy. And so, it seems just blatantly senseless and illogical. So why would the Oversight Committee approve something like this? And I think the answer has to be the fact that Kalin brings in so much money to the university and has such a long history there. His history has always been the study of fear and anxiety. Let me read you a few of the titles of his. You can't believe how many things he's published. This is just page after page of studies, and all of these have to do with his studies. Most of them with monkeys, and some of them with rats. But most of them having. Here's just a few titles: genetic influences on behavioral inhibition and anxiety in juvenile rhesus macaques. There's another one: role of the primate orbitofrontal cortex in mediating anxious temperament. There's another one. Context-specific freezing and associated physiological reactivity as a dysregulated fear response. There's another one. The role of the central nucleus of the amygdala in mediating fear and anxiety in primates. The fear and anxiety is what in monkeys is what he's done for decades. And we really don't have, because of his research, we are not able to treat anxiety in people any better at all. So, on its face, it has no merit at all. On a deeper level, because of the University of Wisconsin's long history with maternal deprivation and its essentially universal condemnation among people who have any concern for animals at all, the idea that they would resurrect this very cruel method is very alarming. So after learning about this and making it a little bit public, people who are members of the Alliance for Animals, who also happen to be University of Wisconsin alumni, started wondering about what they could do. Most of them were just appalled that their university would be resurrecting this really cruel line of study. And so they worked with us, with the Alliance, and we've come up with a new campaign. It's called UW Not in Our Name. The website is uwnotinouraname.org. Contact the university, no matter what university that they attended, and tell them that they're going to withhold any future donations until the university stops its use of maternal deprivation once and for all. It should cancel Kalin studies immediately. Those baby monkeys should be placed with other monkeys, get the socialization they need, and they should create a policy that says that maternal deprivation is a method that will not be used or approved on the University of Wisconsin campuses any longer. There's a pledge online that people can sign. It's been signed right now by nearly 200 alumni. There's people around the world are actually friending the Facebook page. Psychologists and ethicists from other universities have contacted us and said, how can this be happening again? So I hope that you will take the time to look at the website, UW, not in our name, and think how you might be able to become involved as well. Maybe you can send the link, the website, to friends. Maybe you know people who are UW-Madison alumni or UW system alumni. It really doesn't make any difference. It really is a sort of pyramid scheme, isn't it? So the university receives a tremendous amount of money from its use of animals. $200 million a year essentially is what the University of Wisconsin takes in to engage in really horrific experiments on animals. This is just one of them. This is particularly troubling because of this hasn't gone on now for almost 2 decades here at the university. Let me just quote from you, quote just a minute. Researchers here locally were very concerned as well. This is an excerpt from minutes of one of the oversight committees that had to approve these studies. This is, I'm going to quote, this is from the oversight committee minutes. Dr. Lindstrom asked if there has been any discussion about the type of extreme experiments in this study. Dr. Krugner-Higbee, another veterinarian by the way, said yes, and said she feels the creation of nursery-reared infant non-human primates is severe because of what it can do to the young animals. The head veterinarian at the Primate Center has said that he doesn't think that the oversight committees have any authority to stop experiments that are funded by NIH, no matter how cruel. The minutes go on. Dr. Capuano again, he says, he's unsure if the ACOC has the right to tell a PI, the principal investigator, or Ned Kalins in this case, not to do the research because the research may cause harm. He says, Dr. Krugner-Higbee goes on to say, the behavioral damage to the young animals from this type of study is already well known. So even the researchers, even the people inside the institution who see really unsettling things every day and have to deal with it, even they were alarmed at this. Everybody that's looked at this who doesn't have some sort of financial or professional stake in it has pretty much said that they're appalled. We know pediatric psychiatrists who have said this has no bearing on the way we would treat children at all. It's money, it's another paper that's going to be published, and the only thing that's going to come of it is that these baby monkeys are going to, for the very short year that they have to live, their life is going to be just filled with misery. So I hope you'll get involved. It's UW, not in our name. I'm Rick Bogle for the Alliance for Animals. Thanks for watching. Parents, they thought that you should treat children as if they were machines, and if you could handle them in a certain way that they would grow up to be more upstanding people. But in 1935, other psychologists began to look at children that were raised without families. The best known one might be Renee Spitz, who in 1935 began systematic observations of mothers and children and what things mothers did with their children. And then he also started looking at children in orphanages. And he came to the conclusion, and this is a direct quote, the absence of mothering equals emotional starvation. And then in 1946, Dr. Benjamin Spock published the Common Sense book of baby and child care. Spock threw all of the Watson's animals away from their mothers at birth and raising them in relative isolation. They claim that the benefits will accrue to children that have been raised without parents or in situations where they're in homes without caregiving. In 1928, a medical doctor named John Watson wrote a book called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. And this was a quote from him. He said, "Never, never kiss your child. Never hold it in your lap. Never rock its carriage." And for a while, his idea that children should be seen as it and that they shouldn't be treated very kindly was the sort of the norm that doctors tried to communicate to parents. Hi, my name's Rick Bogle. I'm the co-executive director of a Madison-based animal rights organization called the Alliance for Animals. The Alliance was started in 1983 and since that time has been speaking out for all of the animals in the state of Wisconsin, no matter where they are, what's being done to them. The Alliance got started in 1983 because of concerns about what was going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The University of Wisconsin-Madison is the home to one of the now 8 national primate research centers in the United States. They're funded by the National Institutes of Health, and they all have a large number of invasive and cruel experiments going on involving monkeys. But the one I'm going to talk to you about right now is a study that shocks most people when they find out that the university has started it again. And to understand the nature of this, it has to do with maternal deprivation. So I need to first give you a little bit of history of the study of maternal deprivation and the University of Wisconsin-Madison's role in that research. First, let me just tell you a little bit about the history of maternal deprivation, or even the history of childcare. Because most people will tell you that the reason that any use of maternal deprivation, taking young garbage out the window and said, "Don't be afraid to trust your own common sense." He said, "What good mothers and fathers instinctively feel like doing is usually best." Spock's baby book was an instant runaway success. By the time he died in 1998, 50 million copies of the book had been sold. It had been translated into 42 languages. At the time that he died, I believe it was the second most published book, second only to the Bible. In 1948, after World War II, there were a number of children in European orphanages. And the World Health Organization started to look at the problem and try to figure out what could be done for all of the children.